We're also getting word of the first U.S. casualty in this war. Police there say American journalist Brent Renaud was killed by Russian forces in Irpin. CNN's Scott McLean joining me now live from Lviv, and CNN Chief International Correspondent Clarissa Ward is live for us in Kyiv. Scott, to you first. The base is just 11 miles from the border. In fact, instead, I'm going to go to you, Clarissa. We'll try to reestablish our connection with Scott in a moment. But Clarissa, what more are you learning from where you are? And I do want to ask you about the area of Irpin, where the American journalist was killed. That was an area where we saw you showing us refugees who were crowding under the bridge, finding escape.
That's right, Frederica. I mean, this was an area where a lot of international journalists and Ukrainian journalists have been spending a good deal of time, because it was the place here in the city where you could see that sort of tide of humanity flooding in from some of these hardest hit suburbs. That suburb of Irpin, we were just there a couple of days ago. From what we understand, U.S. journalist Brent Renaud and also another photographer, Juan Arredondo, were in Irpin today covering this story and came under heavy fire. Brent, as we know, was killed very tragically. Juan appears to be okay. He's in the hospital getting treated for some kind of a gunshot injury. All of this underscoring the tremendous danger of covering this story, but more importantly, I think, underscoring the fact that Ukrainian civilians are constantly facing multiple types of targeting.
I want to bring in one of Brent's friends, his longtime friend, Christoph Putzel. I believe we have you on Skype, Christoph. Thank you for coming on. I'm very, very sorry for your loss, and I'm glad you can be here and tell us a bit about Brent. How did you find out about his death? What have you learned so far today, Christoph?
I woke up this morning to the news that Brent, longtime best friend, incredible colleague, the best war journalist I think ever existed. Finding out about his passing. You know, Brent had this ability to go anywhere, get any story, listen and communicate what was happening to people that otherwise wouldn't otherwise see it. And it is a devastating loss to journalism today.
What do you know about what he was doing with his colleagues in Ukraine? Was he working on a documentary?
Yeah, he was working on a documentary about refugees. It was a story he was doing around the world, and when the crisis in Ukraine happened, Brent was on the plane the next day, and he was covering a story about refugees coming out of Kiev into Poland, and that's what we know.
I remember you worked with him on multiple projects, but I remember one about Occupy Wall Street like a decade ago. So, you know, Brent was working on projects for the New York Times, for Vice, for others. What stands out to you most about his style of journalism and filmmaking? What made him so special?
Yeah, I mean, Brent just, as I said, we won a DuPont together about 10 years ago for a story we did in Mexico about guns being smuggled from the U.S. Across the border. And what I said at the time when we accepted our award was, the only thing bigger than Brent's balls are his heart. And I stand by that. That's what kind of journalist he was. He could get into any location. He had this ability just to blend in wherever he was, you know, where I would be stopped at the border, like Brent could just walk through because Brent could just blend in. And then he had this ability for people to trust him. He could draw anybody out. You know, the stories he did, he went from, he was in Iraq in the early days, did an incredible story for Discovery Times called Off to War. He won a DuPont for me for the story in Mexico. He did, we did, things like Occupy Wall Street, where we were camping there while editing that piece at night, running back to the office. He won a DuPont for the Times on a story about migrants from South America. He won a Peabody for Vice, a long documentary series called Last Chance High. I mean, you could sit down and spend a week watching all of Brent's stories over the years, back to back, and just be flabbergasted. The career that he had, his ability to reach people, his ability to capture the humanity behind people's suffering is something I've never seen before, and I was just honored to work with him as long as I did.
이제 연말 행사 때 1년